Peter for those of I'm going to introduce Peter for those who don't know him, and then he's going to share some poetry with us. We'll have a chat, and then there'll be a chance for you to put questions. So if you've got any questions that you would like to ask Peter, maybe you could pop them in the chat box, and we'll leave time for that at the end. Um, and I think that's all. So let's crack on, and I'll introduce Peter to you. Now, Peter Mackay is a native Gaelic speaker from the Isle of Lewis, a poet, translator, academic, and a senior lecturer in literature at the School of English at St Andrews University. He's no stranger to literary prizes, a winner of the Donald Meek Prize for Gaelic Literature and the Saltire, get this right, Saltire Scottish Research Book of the Year for the anthology 500 Years of Gaelic Love and Transgressive Verse. His own poetry collections, and I'm not even going to try the Gaelic Peter, Galore and Some Kind of, were shortlisted for the Saltire Poetry Book of the Year, and Some Kind of was longlisted for the Highland Book Prize. So that's no mean feat, no mean list of awards. He's a frequent broadcaster, and he was made Mackay in 2024. Now, I have got a long list of questions for Peter, but I know a fair few names in the audience today, and I know for sure that they're here for the poetry. So I'm going to just start by asking Peter to read for us.
Thanks so much, Claire, for that really nice introduction. And good to meet you all, and thanks for coming out on this Wednesday afternoon. Um, Claire has asked me to read for about 15 to 20 minutes, so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to read bilingually. So in each case, I'll start with the Gaelic first and then the English, so that you hear the soundscapes before, for most of you, you get the sense, I think. Um, and as I was putting it together, I understand that some poems were shared with at least some of you beforehand. I might read a couple of them, but I'm going to read a couple of other ones as well. And strangely, I think the ones that I've chosen today, all to some extent, can be seen as self-reflexive. They talk about the processes of poetry or how poetry forms itself and how it means. And I'm going to read a couple from my first two books and then some more recent stuff. So this is the very first poem in my very first book, Gior or Glior. It's given that title because this is one of the phrases in Gaelic that has come over into English. So this is one of the ways in which we have colonized the English language or given something to the English language, if you want to look at it that way. And the first poem in the book is called Intopper, the Well. There's a frequent image in Irish and Scottish Gaelic poetry of the well at the centre of the village that you go to each day to replenish yourself, to take the drink of the pure culture that is in it, and you become more Gaelic or Irish or Scottish in the process. I'm wary of that because I'm wary of the idea that you will return to the same source and be the same person again and again and again. But I think every time you go to that kind of form of creative inspiration or every time you write a poem, it's an entirely new one and you're an entirely new person. So this is in topper. Bí mitrillicach lag an topper or y fadda ach a gairiru chanile awn. Sa acam rí chruachach an fronis scutch is nice is spatchroch lachan. Jamars clach go mi misc de Lego agus briac an Chile is corduroy. Lá Canile, Stad in Toledo, Panty, Fachlan Archicol, Ichlan Garavail. Chanye Vonor Jolofska and a Chemis and Nuer and ach Ras in the Monchicus Smoor, Skioloch Taunch in the Vloy Cam Isha Clun, Gach Trip Hamika Harish. The Well. I return each day to the well on the edge of the village, but it's not really there. And I have to rebuild it from the scraps of driftwood and gneiss, the rubble of life scattered around. Tuesday, it's a mix of Lego and lies, jam and corduroy. Another time, Toledo steel, pottery shelves, the names of tools, oak feathers. No reflection flickers in the fetid darks, the moor-stained currents of the land, but a story that tells me squint each time I start to repeat it. Where do poems come from. Usually words or sounds or rhythms or annoyances. It's really quite good to start a poem if you're slightly annoyed, and then that gives you at least an impetus for it. Um, but often poems start in those earliest memories as well, in childhood, in the trying to excavate versions of yourself or trying to tell stories of yourself to yourself that you might have forgotten. Um, I like navel gazing as a form of poetry. I like that idea of trying to find your own origins and trying to put it into words. And my mother isn't a hoarder, but she's somebody who never felt the need to throw things out because she had quite a large house on the Isle of Lewis. And she told me about 15 years ago now that she'd found a tin that I had in primary school because I think it was common for people of my generation. At primary school, you'd be given a wee tobacco tin where each night you'd write words out, or the teacher would write them out for you, put it in there, and you'd have to take that tin home and try and memorize them. And I'd only had the slightest memory of this until my mother mentioned it, and I was desperate to know what the words were. Great, fantastic words like somnambulist or flocky knocking hiffilification or whatever it's going to be. And then inside it was cat and rainbow. Much more simple, but in some ways much nicer words. And so this is a poem about that tin. And the translation I'm going to read, and I think the translation that was sent round was one that was done for me by the Belfast poet Kieran Carson. In tinne, de rafami sa bhain scóil thuair mí tinne slevin tanne, fer an cuirin machlan scríb tir scolti an paper. Chainir cainach mar íneach ach chud daibh sa bha osclach gon anamar in is gníomh ar an laim a machas mar bhratan a líon. Idir chul bhalach machanan, is snáb go sirí go dachi chailt, nam cheann han tinir miricich, scatid osclach gon bhrístich sailt. The tin. When I was in primary school, I got this thin-walled tin where I'd stashed my words writ on splinters of paper. I can't remember the design, but how difficult it was to open, without names and deeds leaping out like salmon from a net. The dumb babble of my languages, swimming forever towards their lost ground, the tin in my head rusted, not to be opened, without breaking its crust of salt. I think like many people who write, and especially many people who write poetry, I spend a lot of time hooking around in dictionaries, and a lot of time looking for the right words, or to be honest, words that I should know but never actually learnt, especially words for the natural world. I come from the Isle of Lewis, northwest of Scotland, lots and lots of wind, lots of Atlantic shore, very few trees. And so, in all of my languages, whether it's Gaelic or English, I'm really bad at tree names. And so, there's quite a lot of work that I have to do to try and identify what's an elm or what's an ash or what's a beech, simply because all we had were different forms of conifer, pines and spruce especially. But I'm really interested in the precision of language that comes with that. And the more that you can know about the world around you, simply by gathering the vocabulary that you need and gathering as much vocabulary to be as precise as the natural world as possible. And I think this is one of the things that we have to do, especially in a time of environmental crisis, is be able to talk with as much precision about the things we are at risk of losing. Because otherwise, how can we say what we have lost? And so the next poem is a really short poem, and it's simply imagining the future of language and the future of poetry between two villages on the Isle of Lewis, Shadder, where I grew up, and Borv, which is 2 miles away. And it's trying to think of as many different species of plant or of animal or of bird that could be there, and the infinite length of time it would take to actually know them all. But I think that's part of the point of poetry is to point towards that infinite amount of knowledge that we will never achieve. Maybe. So, this is a poem with a Spanish name, Un futuro en camino, a future on the way. And it's one of those slightly pretentious poems that has an epigram. And this is from Maurice Blanchot, The Space of Literature. And it is the poem is lonely. It is lonely and en route. There is something never quite achieved about poetry or about our knowledge. It's always futural. Shoah. An cóla riamh an sé nach burin cóiseach getar siatar is boroch go nisir anam gach glumach is lochan is struach is Jón is lús. Hai hastar an lí, ach nuair a ruchas io nach bí acin an lá é. Líon bhrochta varabhishling, fochaníise noch, slacadaich is liatrusk. Have you heard tell of the girl who couldn't walk between Shadr and Borv without knowing the name of each stream and ditch and bird and insect and weed? She's still on her way. But when she arrives, oh, won't that be the day of it? A plenitude of bird's foot trefoil, Montbretia, night hollows, and field fairs. I worked for the BBC for a few years as a journalist on TV and radio, and also as a news producer for BBC Alba, the Gaelic TV channel. So the evening news and law, quite often I'd be sitting in the gallery just pressing buttons or counting down or doing very little unless something went wrong. Ideally, you do nothing as a producer because it all goes perfectly. But the BBC was a very strange place to work in many ways, which I won't get into now, except that you never quite knew what was going to happen in the building at any point, quite what atmosphere or mood or who was going to be there. And there was one day that the Glasgow group Bell and Sebastian were actually doing a rehearsal for a performance on the review show that night, which was going to be broadcast out of Pacific Key for about 7 hours in the reception of the building. And because it's quite an odd building, just getting the sound quality right, it took that long. And it was really interesting doing your work with having this building noise, but also this building perfection of noise around you because it got better and better after the first version. And of course, I use that as a metaphor because we're always looking for metaphors, aren't we? So this was a nice handy wee metaphor for the creative process. And this is a poem that I think was shared with you called Ciad Drach or First Draft. In Esgyd, Geish mi Bell and Sebastian a gulachachas an creadach bio ar the review show. Ik chloich in or an trip sa ríist haris ar seach na 8 in a híd an fusclan Pacific Key. A chiad trip fa gran or mar an oran, a chian o las lasach as réoch siimpliach, yn jay jaich dus an turis fa nar san tocalach chawn. Yn ro isioch yn ish dochiachante, agus an toran ar córa dosgriste agos nála. Chaine seohrí rag fel mi inis nam fan ar Ben Sebastian, ach díroch fel lán isacha déthe a gianu. Gwyl ffeim y cialan ar hynachich, nio imitachich, nio vleich, gystrechen o gos las. Gaf mo lysgal, lif dyr chawr. Nach yn dan sy gianu sy'n ach, gyw sy'n rwy'n dynnes sy'n sy'n yr ŵr, yn jay jaich na ficha tri harish, na ha i enich. First draft. One afternoon, I listened to Bell and Sebastian rehearse for a live performance on the review show, playing the same song again and again over the course of 7 or 8 hours in the foyer of Pacific Key. The first time, I hated the song, its baggy sentimentality, its predictable harmonies, but by the 10th or 12th go, it had tightened the very walls of the building, had squeezed the predictable into the inevitable, left an ineluctable mark in the air. This is not to say that I'm a fan of Bell and Sebastian, but just that they know what they're doing, that art has to be distilled or multiplied or ground down to a filament that can catch light. My apologies, dear reader, that this poem doesn't do this, but at least now you can imagine a point after 10 or 20 rehearsals, however many takes, when it might. I don't know if any of you are bilingual. I imagine you probably are. One of the things that always happens to me when I do readings between the two languages, my vowel sounds go all over the place in one or other of the languages. And when reading that poem in English, I was really having, because I was feeling the vowel, my mouth being in the wrong shape for the vowels in English. So apologies if it was a little bit static at some points. I was fighting against different languages wanting to emerge for me at the same time, which is always fun. Um, so I'll read a couple of more poems, I think. And yeah, I'll read a couple of new, they're all going to be new ones that weren't in any of my books. Gyor Gavor is one of those words that exists and carries over between Gaelic and English. One of the really nice words that we have in between Gaelic and Scots is the word buroch, mess, chaos, haphazardness, whatever it's going to be. It's something that isn't orderly. And I think that was a really nice word to play with. And in the manner of the Australian poet Les Murray, I basically took this word for a walk. And saw what kind of how I would imagine this the Burach as an actual physical entity, or multiple physical entities, or historical phenomena, or just let it be whatever it wanted to be. So I took a poem, wrote a poem where the Burach transforms itself into different types of ungainly or erratic mess, maybe. And this is a poem that has been published and has been read a few places and has since been changed because I'm still in the process of reworking it again and again. It's not quite in its full form. So it is a bit of a burach itself, which is nice. Yn burach. Yn burach galor cain y brwnbal o'r droch y siorish, trapile misg yn lwch tyrish, agus maint i'r afale. Y fiach nyr i ges y lorog yn ddain ch, a dorf chaif yn itch, yn charwm burach y rif y brian an the ho. O hen, ha mi oomnach ag ar bhí páirs an bhuaach ach. Nuair a gobh oomnach ag ne cor a bhuaach a sin. Het séidir le cád chnáf agus fuamarc na strúich tro lín sin mar isce, tro gynnar fína a chamarchas uaine sias a getan an ba. Bhíoch na sémas íchir bhuaach ag tronaíchas a bhalla seo ach, inis han jorlam náisianta tasmanach a bhuairich de jólas an de bhrain, nach teach idir cheanga a cháast. Déjà vu agus chaol, láhan sglúdach a déanana búach de gimlan grín. Jaag sin dúich é bhach as rhaint of búach é, nio, jaag sin búach é agus rhaint of dúich é. Dhéanach na Rómanach fiús búach agus herciad fostas, ach déon jifir go fat sa ha búr a rag agus tséfach a gáil. Hír na beáns na búachcan, gus an bis an beá an búach seo ríist sláins. Nach seanna sé búach bach bíad a go tain ag an doras. The búach is mumbling its way along George IV Bridge, trying to weave a route through the tourists and the locals that will block out the ch they find difficult. Never mind the itch, and all the búach was never spoken here. Mispronunciation has long been a feature of the búach's life, but even if it is unspeakable, is that really the búach's problem? Not everything is fully digested when vowels ooze down centuries like rain through a grit of consonants, nuance, rhyme to the cowgate. The Jacobites would have búrach through the night in this city, and now the National Library displays a búrach of knowledge that sits untranslated inside. A feeling of déjà vu, a forgotten resonance, spidery hands lolloping all over the elegant margins. We left you a country and you made a búrach of it. Or, we left you a búrach and you made a country of it. Even the Romans would make a búrach and call it peace. What does it matter as long as there's búrach enough left over for a wee dram? Slán Java, land of hills and búrachs, lang may your búrach reek. Make sure to buy a wee bit of búrach on the way out. And the last poem I'm going to read is a very short one, which was written after a 13th century Irish poet. That I found this poem in the anthology Bone and Marrow, um, Clav agus Smear, an anthology of Irish poetry from the medieval to the modern. And it's a COVID poem in some ways, simply because I would never have had the opportunity to read this 900-page anthology of Irish poetry unless I'd had COVID and was stuck in bed and forced myself to actually do something that um, opened doors and windows to different time periods as well. And this is from one of the stanzas of Gilifrige Macconmia's poem Chachra Hicon O Messenger Who Cometh from Rome. And I realize now that it started with the suggestion that you could build your own well out of Lego, corduroy jam, and lies. And this is another poem about poetry being made of lies. Make of that what you will. Úl. Gyda bardoch lán bríacan, sé bríacan maranoch o húnta, agus chynne bríacan sialadoch. Sy'n gwyd yripsych yn yn ddan, har o ffyr yn ie agus fi marach ach siawl, cho brias am briac, cho milish. Although poetry is full of lies, they are lasting ones, not fleeting or fly by night. You can trust a poem. It wasn't true yesterday, won't be true tomorrow, but look, how beautiful the lie, how sweet. More than thank I many thanks to you all.
Oh, what a joy. What a nice way to spend your lunchtime. Um, I will start asking anyone who's got questions to pop them into the chat box. But in the meantime, I kind of wanted to start with a couple of questions around the mackership and the sort of bigger picture, and then maybe come in and pick up on some of the things you've mentioned and talked about today. So you're 6 months into your 3-year term.
Yeah,
How's it going? What's it like?
it's quite fun.
What's
It's weirder and better and more various than I ever expected. It's come in really interesting cycles of having to do lots of interviews with the media, getting to go to lots of schools and speak to primary school kids. I've planted two tr trees in two different places, which I didn't expect. I've had to write a lot of poems about trees, which is partly why my anxieties about coming from Lewis and not knowing the names of trees have come up. And I've been able to speak to some really, really interesting people about what they're doing, libraries, publishers, and teachers about their love for literature, as well as all of the people who read and write the work as well, and the school kids who have much more imagination than I do.
They're amazing, aren't they? Once
Yeah.
you just drop a seed and um, where it goes is astonishing. So the general remit of as it's published by the Scottish Government is to promote literacy and poetry and writing. And does that mean you have sort of specific targets or things that you want to do with the Mackership, or is it more that you're sort of guided by the diary that's already in place that others have conceived? How does it work?
There's no real diary. It's a lot more flexible and a lot, in some ways, more responsive to that. It's if people ask me to do things, and I'll see if I can fit it in, and then
Yeah,
I'll build a pattern from that. For the government, they simply want 3 to 4 poems a year, and then the broader remit of encouraging literacy, writing, and experimentation with all the forms of writing that we can. And so basically, I go to as many schools as I can, I speak to as many young people as I can, and as many writers groups. Beyond that, the main thing that I want to do over the 3 years that I'm in the post is celebrate as many different languages as possible because I am the first Gaelic speaking Mackay. Every other Mackay before could speak Scots as well as English, or in the case of Eddie Morgan, as many languages as you care to imagine or could care to invent. And one of the things I've been wanting to do is to try and find ways of celebrating not just Gaelic and Scots and English, but all of the languages that are spoken in Scotland today, and to start a bit of a conversation between the poets. I've been really lucky in my own career because I speak a minoritized language, that I'm often asked to take part in translation workshops internationally. So I've done lots of translation workshops with Slovenian poets, Slovakian poets, Czech, French, and so on. And I was wanting to actually encourage this within Scotland. So one of the things that I'm doing for the Edinburgh International Book Festival and for the next 3 years, hopefully, and other groups is to bring poets who are writing in Scotland in many different languages to respond to each other's work. And so in August, there'll be six poets at the book festival who have been paired up to write poems in different languages in response. And we'll have Gaelic, Scots, Macedonian, um, Spanish, and various dialects of Italian appearing in there as well. And it's just really interesting to see the different types of conversation that are happening within Scotland as a multilingual country. And it's really heartening to me being able to listen into these conversations.
And that was actually something I was going to ask you about. So if anyone's interested, that event's on Monday, the 11th of August at 6 o'clock in the book festival. And the tickets go on sale on the 21st, I think. So you can get hold of them then. Um, I think that what you're talking about I've seen it described somewhere as you saying that you want to do this because you want to build bridges um, between the languages and use language, I suppose, to build bridges. And I think that is a lot of what Open Book is trying to do, maybe not across different languages, although we do deliver sessions in Arabic and in Gaelic and Scots. But could you say a little bit more about this sort of idea of what hearing and being exposed to language that's not your natural tongue does for your mind and your writing and the way you respond to people.
And so I was lucky enough that I'm bilingual from my earliest memories. And so I had Gaelic and English before I went to school, though I think I was more Gaelic speaking until I went to primary school. And then almost lost my Gaelic entirely for various reasons of education. But it means that I've always been aware that you're a slightly different person in each language that you speak. And so you're going to engage with the world differently. There are different things you can or can't do. There are different people you can or can't be. Um, and when I became an adult, that became less scary. And so it was less scary for me then to take the risk of learning languages or being in situations where I wasn't fluent in a language because I knew this is only one version of myself. It's not the end, it's not a final comment on who I am. And so, for better or worse, I'm quite happy to blunder around with minimal amounts of language, but trying to speak it in different places. And my French pronunciation is terrible. There's a line in French in the poem The Tin that I don't read out in public because it's so bad. So I just translate that into English. Um, but the main thing is that you get to use the different resources in different languages, partly as tools, but partly as expressions of different versions of yourself. And we are play acting all the time in every language that we use because we are shifting between register. Even if we were speaking in English, we'd be choosing this as a slightly elevated register. I haven't sworn yet, and I actually swear quite a lot in English. I really like the playfulness of swearing, but it doesn't seem appropriate. But it means we get to play who we are. Um, in Spanish, the example I use, though I'm not very good at it anymore, is when I was learning Spanish, I deliberately chose to try and have the voice of the narrator from the films of Pedro Almodóvar. And he speaks much lower than I do. So puedo hablar español como esto, pero no es. So I speak in Spanish, or I try to with this much deeper, my shoulders back, much better posture than I have in English, because you can slightly change yourself in each language.
And that's brilliant. Do you think that helps with your precision, your love of precision of language and your search for the right words? Do you find that when you're writing, sometimes the word you want, you know it in one language, and does that come in? Do you stick it in that language? How does that shade in?
It helps in some ways, and in other ways, it means that everything is provisional. And so rather than there being a precise word that everything is going to click into place like a door closing, it's rather when you're translating between languages. And I quite often will start in Gaelic, do a version, and then a version in English, and then let them develop alongside each other. But it means that everything can be a little bit fluid and flexible. Um, I was reading Carlo Rovelli's book on physics last week for something else, and it's less Newtonian. It's not that everything is rigidly placed in its own position, but everything is in flux and everything can be changed into these systems. Michael Longley, the poet, used to say that you never finish a poem, you just abandon it. And there's a
Yeah.
point where it's an abandon. And it's slightly like that, but sometimes it's more polished than others when it's abandoned. And the difficulty is if you're working between two languages or have the same text in two languages, there's always a sense of abandonment going on somewhere there.
Yeah, and I mean, and as a reader, I really enjoy coming across a word in a different language embedded into a poem that I'm reading because the signal that sends to me is this is the perfect word for this, what I want to express in this poem. And it sends me scurrying off to look up that word or learn. And you know, I really enjoy that. So I'm really looking forward to your event where we have writers who I think is it fair to say that all of them write in English and another language?
All of
At
them
least
can,
one, yeah.
all of them can write in English. Not all of them write in another language, and so the we have Roshni Gallagher has a really interesting exploration of other languages that she feels guilty that she doesn't speak.
Yeah,
And so her English is haunted in some ways by the presence of other languages. And I was really interested in that phenomenon as
yeah.
well. So that an uneasy relationship with English, as well as having the possibility of switching between English and other languages. All the rest speak at least two, if not many more languages, and there are some ferociously literate people going to be taking part in the panel.
That sounds great. I'm just going to quickly have a look at the chat so that I don't run out of time and not ask any of the questions that have been popped up here. Somebody's asking, could you pop the title of the Irish anthology that you mentioned into the chat?
I've put that in already, so that's a few below it.
Perfect. And then Maya is asking, do you have any plans to work with Scottish Asian groups?
I'd love to, and it's just finding the right people that would help make up for my limitations, basically. And so people to partner with that. And if you have any suggestions, I'd really, really like to hear it. I'm also hoping to work if we can get some funding with a group out of the CCA in Glasgow that works especially with refugee and asylum seeker groups and does creative writing workshops there and to do a separate event based on that. But Maya, if you've got any suggestions, that would be great.
If you feed them into us, Maya, we can make sure they're passed on to Peter. That's probably the easiest way to pass on any thoughts you have on that. Daphne's saying that she loves the tin, and that she read, you said in relation to the poem that language is free, but we can't be free in our using of it. And she's wondering if, although the poet might not be free of haunting, repression, etc., as readers we can be free. And as she says, swim away with the salmon.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want as readers. You can definitely ignore what the writer thinks. The writer has stopped in the process a long time ago. The text is yours, the poem is yours to read as you want. The I remember sea kayaking off the coast of Skye once, and my aunt and uncle run an outdoor centre up there, and kayaking past a fish farm, which was an incredibly depressing thing to kayak past, except that some creature, I don't know, had ripped open the nets at one of the tops of the huge nets where you'll have thousands of fish, and the salmon had seen this. And so you were seeing them one after the other trying to leap from the water. I think it was a meter and a half to get through this hole and then out into the open sea. In some ways, the poet's that hideous net containing all of the salmon in there, and you are the readers are the holes, the one allowing the meaning to be whatever it's going to be. Set it as free as possible. That was a terrible metaphor. Apologies.
Not at all. I'm just thinking of those salmon, with the hope in their eyes as they see the way out to freedom and, the leap of faith, as it were.
Yeah.
Um, I'm just thinking about what you're saying about navel gazing, as we all do if we write or we try and write and pinning down ideas. And I also had one of those tins with the words on them. Um, and once you'd learned them, you were allowed to then move them to a folder that you could slot them in, and you were once you had so many, you got an extra 10 minutes to choose free activities.
Yeah.
It's all coming back to me. There might be a poem on that somewhere lurking. But how does that contrast of, poets navel gazing when they're writing and then almost releasing that poem out into the world and then losing it? How do those two different like aspects of writing sit together for you?
I think they sit together interestingly because when you're writing poetry, you're engaged with language, which is a time-charged medium and is very slippery. So language itself, and this is Eddie Morgan's phrases, is a shapeshifter. And so even if I think that I have got the perfect evocative f- combination of words to express my own memory or what I remember of that tin or my own experience in primary school, I don't have control over that. Those words are going to escape from me, are going to change on the page anyway. And I think you just have to accept that. And part of the task is to try and put the words together in as resonant a way as possible that somebody else is going to have a similar opening experience like opening that tin, but it's never going to be exactly the same. But
Yeah.
it's allowing, and so I don't know what kind of activities you could have had in that 10 minutes of extra activities. My teacher was the daughter of a fisherman, so we had a fishing boat in our classroom that you could go and dress up in and things like this. But we all have the opening of the tin opens that memory space for you and memory space for me in different ways. And I think that's really nice. And so it's trying to control the language in such a way that various effects are created, but then it opens and goes its own way.
Yeah, and I think it's that trick that for me, certainly the poems that I love best are the ones that just tweak something that I recognize, but then leave enough space for me to feel it in a way which I know is personal to me and can't possibly be what the poet was intending, but it almost makes that connection with the poet. And it might be someone I don't know at all or someone I've never met. And I just love that sort of that skill of just enough gaps.
Just enough gaps. And I think it's enough gaps for you to be surprised yourself while you're writing. And if you aren't surprised yourself in the process of writing a poem, I'm slightly wary of it. I need something to have happened that I don't fully understand. And I think that's the gap that will probably resonate for other people as well. Um, Something that's out of my control as a writer.
Yeah. And I think that sort of idea of the surprise, that sort of resonating with me in relation to your comments about reworking. And you were saying the poem isn't quite finished and you've read it in a different way. And is that to do with the surprise or to do with the unexpected in that poem that it feels like it's not quite where you expect it to be?
Yes, I think that's crucial, and especially, I think this is one of the reasons that I go to dictionaries a lot and other poets do is to change your vocabulary. Because if you end up just using words that you use every day that are very accustomed to you, you're no longer surprised by them. Um, and I've got another poem, and I've no idea why, but I end up comparing the eye of a visiting minister to my grandfather's house to the eye of a partridge. And it was just the sound of the partridge was perfect. And in both languages, Gaelic and English, I was going, I had never made that comparison before, but the sound led me in there to this different way of actually reshaping that memory in my mind. And so being led by the language itself in two instant ways is part of the task to see where the sounds will take you.
That's just really interesting. One of the in our open book creative writing sessions, which I know a lot of the listeners today will take part in, one of the sort of warm-ups we'll do is we'll create a word hoard and then we'll share the words, half a dozen words each on a particular theme, and be encouraged to steal other people's words at that point,
Yeah.
and to try and work them into your poem. Because when you're putting words that you wouldn't normally use or words that you wouldn't think belong to you or you didn't think of when you were given that prompt, it takes your writing in really interesting directions and unexpected directions. And I think creates that surprise. And you might come back 2 months later to the poem and go, oh, no, that word's not me. That's not right. I'm taking it out. But just, I think that's us seeking to achieve the same thing that you're talking about.
And I think it goes back to the comment you made earlier about finding in a poem a word or phrase in another language, and the effect that that has as well. You have this in your own language too. This is a word that is other, an alien word. It's like a space nugget that has dropped to Earth and is in your poem. And how do you feel about that? And sometimes you let it sit there in an undigested way and going, okay, actually, this is a different force of gravity that is shaping everything around it. Or you go back in the editing process and go, that makes no sense. It just doesn't work here. It's wrecking everything, and you have to move it out. But there's always this process of either trying to weave things in or to leave them sitting there like erratic boulders in a landscape that have no geological reason for being there, but make it a lot more interesting that they are there.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's fascinating. I'm going to go back to the chat box, and Philip is saying that she's intrigued about the idea of poetry being a lie, and wonder if you could tell us more about that, the difference between an untruth and make believe, perhaps, and the motivations of each.
Um, and so this is slightly difficult for me in some ways because um, I really like the idea of poetry tells its truth slanted, and so poetry's truth is never um, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It is always partially a lie or it is partially angled or biased. And this is how I would approach all writing or all make-believe, because you are creating a world of lies, of parts of partial truths or different angles on the world. I was, though, listening again to Harold Pinter's Nobel Prize speech earlier this week, and thanks to Lee Moffat for sharing that with me again, where he is very, very wary of this. And he does make the distinction between, as an author, he is interested in lies and line and storytelling, but as a citizen, he is terrified of it.
Mm.
Because we do live in a world where truth is harder and harder to establish, and we do live in a political time where the idea of truth is being abused and done away with to try and take away power and trying to shift power into different hands. And that's terrifying. The idea that you can just have leaders saying, creating their own alternative truths or facts as it may be, and using what should be the pristine domain of fiction and poetry and art in creating of other worlds, and in fact, and more or less using that as a basis of politics is very, very worrying.
And I
And
think that shades into as well the difficulty, even if you're aware of that, and even if you are reading these sources with an eye that is saying, I believe this not to be true, our ability to verify and our skills in verifying what is the truth are being denuded as well.
yeah, and and this is one of the minute that you get into any form of descriptive prose or poetry or vocabulary, you realize how hard it is to be true to anything, to actually to encompass the fullness of anything. If any of you have read the beginning of On a Raised Beach by Hugh McDermott, he has about 20 lines there just trying to use words to describe stones that come close to their stoniness. And it's impossible. You cannot express stoniness. And the difficulty we have as responsible users of language is that we, on the one hand, know, okay, we can never be as accurate as we would like to be, as truthful as we would like to be. As responsible citizens, we have to say, okay, there's a standard that has to be maintained.
Mm.
We might never be 100% accurate, but we cannot accept this level of falsehood, this level of deceit, this level of simply abusing language.
And I think that shades into a really interesting conversation, which could go on for days. And I'm not sure we've got space for today, but around the sort of the navel gazing that we've talked about, but also our memories. And when we think we're being truthful, And we're, as you say, doing our best to be truthful. But and I remember having a really short poem appear in a journal and showing it proudly to my sister. My sister going, "What are you talking about? It didn't happen like that at all." And it was around my mom and the death of my mom, and it was my recollection, and it was obviously loaded with all sorts of grief and memories. But my sister's recollection, and she was in the room at the time. I think that has a really interesting bearing as well on our writing and where we find truth and what we attempt to do with truth.
Claudia Hammond, who is a psychologist and a bookseller, she's got a really good book on memory and time and how difficult it does for us to actually perceive time or remember anything accurately, and how most of our old metaphors for memory don't work. It's not a storehouse, it's not a warehouse, it's not a memory palace, but might be more akin to a group of people working on a road trying desperately to fill in potholes, but the memory ends up being what the pothole is filled with rather than what was there before. And it's this process of invention. Really good book. I can't remember its name, which is terrible, but
I'll find it.
lots of different metaphors you can use as well, and really interesting ways of looking at your own processes of reconstruction and the difficulties that means for things like legal processes. And so, what color jacket was the person running away wearing? And you will have people who entirely differently remember these things.
Yeah,
One of the things I do in the day job, because I lectured at St. Anne's University, when teaching Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway,
yeah.
because she uses pockets of memory and she uses this way of combining the past and the present is really interesting. Is halfway through the class, just tell everybody to stop, close their eyes for 10 seconds, and imagine they are eight again. And they don't have to share it. They don't have to tell us what their imagination was, but their experience of the present now and the class we are going through is entirely shaped then by exactly that memory that's formed. So everybody has, if there's seven students, seven different perceptions of the present and seven different versions of the past and present come together. And the time that we're all experiencing is utterly different.
Mm, mm. Which complicates the whole truth discussion
It,
just
it,
beyond measure.
it
Lynn,
makes it very hard to get the students back to talking about Mrs. Dalloway, certainly.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Lynn is asking if you'll be doing any more online events. She's thinking about your Edinburgh collaboration with the poets at the book festival. She's based in the Highlands and just loves to take advantage of seeing things.
Yeah, I hope to. I'll certainly be doing other online events. And with that project, I hope to. I just need to speak to the book festival and see how the logistics of that will work. And we'll probably need to try and get some funding from somewhere to expand it as much as possible.
There's a question about what language do you find the most difficult to write poetry in?
Uh, I tried in Danish. I was very bad, but simply that's because my Danish wasn't very good at all. The There are different demands and different poetic traditions in, say, Gaelic and English, which means that there are different kinds of things that is possible in the two languages. Um, and it's going to depend on the poem I'm wanting to write, or the start point, or if it's a word or a cadence or an image, um, and where it goes from there. In Gaelic, you can get away with abstract nouns and adjectives a lot more than you can in English. And so there is many of the things that have been disapproved of in English in the last 100 years because A, they're too emotional, or because they're too fluffy, because um they tell rather than showing, because they're not based on an image. You can still do in Gaelic. And so you can use the word love or affection or friendship in big, expansive ways, and it doesn't seem quite as flat or sentimental as it does uh in English. The difficulty of saying I love you in the English language, because it's been said so many times before in films and novels and things. Does it mean the same way as Hagil Lacamorst in Gaelic? Not quite. And so you just have to be careful that you are writing to the requirements of the language you are in. There are different difficulties with that. Just depends what you want to do.
And in the Gaelic is my unacknowledged, uh, e- I guess, expectation is that there are words missing because it is a language that in my, I guess, understanding of it w was a practical, not particularly written down until more recently. Is that fair? Is that
And,
true? I know several Gaelic speakers who would say they're very comfortable speaking Gaelic, but they wouldn't write Gaelic.
and I think that does make sense because, say, the first book of a vernacular Gaelic was published in 1751. The first
Okay,
vocabulary
yeah,
was 1741. So we have had 250 years plus of a written vernacular language. I think the difficulty is that the when the Gaelic language went into process of decline in the 18th and 19th centuries, this was the period of large-scale industrialization across the UK. And so there was almost a conservative mode in Gaelic of let's try and protect what we have rather than be as fully expansive and shifting
yeah,
into an industrial vocabulary and way of looking at the world. So many of the words you could say, or many of the metaphors, are still connected to the land use, farming, fishing, or the Bible. And it's very, very hard to understate just how important the Bible was as a text of written language and shared
yeah,
um, images. And so, if you want to talk about philosophy, say many of the words and ideas are similar to religious ones. And so, it's almost a shared sphere. That's the negative way of looking at it. Say it could perhaps be
yes.
seen as being slightly narrow. However, I worked at the BBC when every day you were watching a language being invented, which was great because it's a language that can be used about any topic in the world. And if you haven't had a word for this new thing that is you have to discuss on the news, you see over a process of a few hours of different producers and presenters trying to reformulate and phrase it to the in their own dialects or their own voices. And it's this really vibrant process of a language evolving before your very eyes.
That was exactly where I was going to go with this next. The corollary to that is that you have the opportunity to be growing and influencing and changing and creating and inspiring the language and almost breathing life into it. Um,
Yeah, breathing life into it. And there are responsibilities and caveats that go with that. There was the great example a few years back where the Danish concept of hygge or hyggeligt, where everything is cozy, was
yeah.
transported to Scotland. And I think it was Visit Scotland that used the word cósacoch, which means you live in a crevice. So it doesn't quite have the same coziness, though one of the 15 meanings does. And so you just have to be careful when you're creating neologisms that you have as close to the meaning as you want.
It made me, when I was thinking about this, it made me think about the sort of Arcadian and Norwegian, the kennings and the creating words. I think one of the words for sea is whale road, and one of the words for body is bone house.
Yeah.
And it kind of made me think, well, I wonder if that's how it works. You find those words that have an association that you can understand and you can mold and create and give life to a new word that is based on the history and the language and what went before, but has a new meaning and a new life.
Yeah. Don Patterson talks about the role of poetry being similar to the horseman's word, the which is twain, two things working together. So putting two things together that have never been together before, like Whale Road or
Yeah,
Bone House, and creating a new concept, world, way of looking at the world through that. And it's great to be able to do this. So kennings are great. The compound nouns or compound phrases, yes. You can be wonderfully baroque and extravagant with them as well. And then you have to tone it down a little bit.
exactly. Philippa's just thanking you and saying that resonates, and she wanted you to know that the group had a discussion about the poem last week, and that was why they were particularly keen to hear you on that one. And Natalie from Stans has just popped up a message there that there's going to be a Mrs. Dalloway symposium in St Andrews later this year. If anyone wants to go and close their eyes and imagine their 8-year-old self, they would be able to do that there.
That will be fantastic. We've got fantastic wolf scholars at St Andrews. Much better than I am. I just teach it. I don't know that much, but we have some really, really good wolf scholars. So that'll be really interesting.
So we're coming to the end of our time together. I can't think of a lovelier way to spend my lunch hour. So thank you so much for your generosity and for sharing your poetry, and your thoughts with us, Peter. And thanks to everybody for coming along and joining in, because I know you've given up your lunchtime as well. So, and thanks again to Stanza for all their support in putting this together.
Thanks so much, Claire, and thank you to you all for being here and for all the great questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. Bye now.
Bye bye.